In the summer of 1978, the newest, tallest building on one of the most expensive blocks in Manhattan had a structural problem large enough that, in the wrong storm, it could have collapsed. Not after decades of slow decay. In a single afternoon, during a storm strong enough that New York City sees one roughly like it once every 16 years. The people working inside that building did not know. The people living in the apartment towers across the street did not know. Even most of the engineers who had originally signed off on the design did not know, because the one man who discovered the flaw was the same man who had designed the building in the first place, and he made a decision that very few executives are ever forced to make. Tell the truth immediately, pay to fix it in complete secrecy, and hope nobody ever finds out how close it came. What happened over the following 3 months? Welders working through the night, while the building stayed open for business, a hurricane forming off the Atlantic coast, and a bill quietly paid through an insurance policy instead of a courtroom, stayed almost entirely out of the public record for the next 17 years. In this video, we are going to walk through exactly how one of the most celebrated skyscraper designs of the 1970s ended up sitting on a hidden structural flaw, and why a small change made on the construction site, one meant to save a relatively small amount of time and money, turned out to matter more than almost anything else in the entire design. Then we are going to do what we did with Lake Paynor. We are going to follow the money. What did it actually cost to fix a problem like this in total secrecy? Who paid for it? And why, in this specific case, paying quietly turned out to be the responsible choice rather than a cover-up. We will look at the exact engineering decision that created the vulnerability, the phone call that reopened the math a year later, the repair campaign that happened almost entirely at night, the real bill behind it, and then we will zoom out, because this building is not an isolated case. It is one instance of a pattern that shows up whenever an organization discovers a catastrophic risk that it created itself and has to decide, in private, exactly what silence is worth. Welcome to the Money Current. Chapter 1. The Tower That Had Nowhere to Stand. To understand why this building ended up with such an unusual and ultimately dangerous structural design, you have to start with a piece of land Citicorp did not fully own. St. Peter's Lutheran Church sat on the northwest corner of the block the bank wanted to build on, and the congregation refused to simply sell and move away. What they agreed to, after negotiation, was letting Citicorp build in the airspace above and around the church, on the condition that a brand new, freestanding church building be constructed on that same corner, physically independent from the tower going up around it. That simple condition created a real engineering problem. A 59-story tower, more than 270 meters tall, could not simply plant support columns at its four corners the normal way, because one of those corners had to stay completely open for the new church below. The solution the project's structural engineer, William LeMessurier, came up with was, for its time, genuinely radical. Instead of four corner columns, the entire tower would be lifted onto four massive columns, 9 stories tall, positioned not at the corners, but at the midpoint of each of the building's 4 sides, straddling the church like enormous stilts. It solved the real estate problem elegantly. It also meant the building's entire weight and wind load had to travel sideways, through the structure, before reaching the ground, an arrangement almost no skyscraper of that scale had ever used before. Chapter 2. The brace, the damper, and the switch made on site. Moving all of that wind load sideways to 4 midpoint columns required a support system running through the skin of the building itself. LeMessurier's team designed a network of diagonal steel braces, arranged in a repeating chevron pattern, essentially a series of stacked letter V's, wrapped around the building's exterior for 8 stories at a time, carrying wind forces down toward the columns, to further reduce how much the tower would sway in strong wind, which mattered enormously for occupant comfort at that height. The design also included something only a handful of buildings on Earth had at the time: a tuned mass damper, a 400-ton block of concrete sitting near the top of the tower on a thin film of oil, designed to slide gently against the building's sway and cancel out a meaningful share of the motion. On paper, this combined system was celebrated as brilliant, using measurably less steel than a conventional design would have required for building this size and shape. But during construction, A detail changed that almost nobody outside the project ever heard about. LeMessurier's original design called for the joints in that diagonal bracing to be welded, a slower, more expensive process at height. The steel contractor proposed switching many of those connections to bolted joints instead, faster and cheaper to install on a fast-moving job site. A junior engineer on LeMessurier's own team reviewed the substitution and signed off on it, concluding the bolted joints were still strong enough for the wind loads the code required the building to withstand. Nobody flagged it as unusual. Nobody escalated it. It was, by every account afterward, a completely reasonable-looking decision, made under completely normal construction pressure, to save time and to save money. Chapter 3. The question nobody had asked. The building's design, like almost every building of that era, had been checked against wind blowing straight into each flat face of the tower, because that was what the building code of the time required engineers to calculate. What the code did not require, and what almost nobody in the industry routinely checked at the time, was how the structure responded to quartering winds, gusts hitting the building diagonally, at its corners, rather than head-on. For a conventional rectangular building, that omission rarely mattered much. For this specific tower, with its unusual midpoint columns and its diagonal chevron bracing, it mattered enormously because the geometry of that bracing meant corner winds could load certain joints far harder than straight-on winds ever would. The story LeMessurier told for years afterward, and the version that eventually became famous, was that in the summer of 1978, close to a year after the tower opened, he received a call from an engineering student, questioning why the building's columns sat at the middle of each face, instead of at the corners, and whether that made the structure more vulnerable to angled wind. Later research into the case has complicated exactly who first raised that question. Some accounts credit a different caller entirely, but what is not in dispute is what LeMessurier did next. He sat down and reran the numbers himself, this time using the real, as-built bolted connections instead of the welded ones from his original drawings, and this time testing wind hitting the building at an angle, not just straight on. Chapter 4. 16 years, not 1600. What LeMessurier found, working through the calculations over several tense weeks, was worse than he had expected. With the bolted joints as actually built, and factoring in quartering winds, the original design had never specifically tested. Several of the tower's connections could be overstressed well, before reaching anything close to a once-in-a-century storm. His revised numbers suggested the building could suffer a serious structural failure in a windstorm, with a return period of roughly 16 years, a storm New York City sees, on average, more than 6 times a century, not once. There was one factor working in the building's favor, the 400-ton tuned mass damper at the top, which reduced the sway enough to meaningfully lower the odds of failure in an average storm. But that damper needed a continuous supply of electricity to function, and a storm severe enough to threaten the joints was also a storm capable of knocking out power to lower Manhattan. Without the damper running, LeMessurier's own estimate of the building's odds of a serious structural failure in any given year rose sharply. LeMessurier has since described, in interviews given decades later, that in the days after finishing these calculations, he genuinely considered the possibility that his career and his reputation were about to be destroyed either way, whether he spoke up or stayed silent. What he chose to do next is the actual center of this story. Chapter 5. The repair nobody was told about. LeMessurier did not stay silent, and he did not simply resign and let someone else discover the problem later. He reported the flaw to Citicorp's leadership, to his own professional liability insurers, and to structural engineers working for the city of New York, laying out exactly what he had found and exactly what it would take to fix it. The decision that followed, made jointly by the building's owner, the engineer, and the insurers, was to repair the tower immediately, but without a public announcement, out of concern that publicizing an unproven risk of collapse in a fully occupied Manhattan office tower could trigger a panic disproportionate to the actual danger, tank the value of every lease signed inside it, and empty out a building that, with the repair completed, would be perfectly safe. Over the following weeks, welding crews arrived after the building closed each evening and worked through the night, reinforcing roughly 200 bolted joints by welding thick steel plates directly over each connection. then clearing the site before employees returned the next morning. The building stayed fully occupied, by day, the entire time. The repair campaign ran through August and September of 1978, and during those same weeks, Hurricane Ella was tracking up the Atlantic coast toward the northeastern United States, before eventually curving away from New York. City emergency officials, informed of the real risk, quietly prepared an evacuation plan covering roughly a 10-block radius around the tower, a plan that, because the storm turned away and the repairs held, was never actually used. Chapter 6: The Bill and Who Actually Paid It. Once the reinforcement work finished, the building had, by every engineering account since, a genuinely sound structure, arguably stronger against wind than most comparable towers built around the same time. The repair itself was widely reported, once the story finally became public, to have cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million in 1978 terms, covering steel, welding labor working overnight shifts for weeks, engineering oversight, and the logistics of running a construction project inside a fully occupied office tower, without disrupting the businesses working there during the day. That bill was covered primarily through LeMessurier's own professional liability insurance, along with contribution from Citicorp itself, and it never turned into a public lawsuit because the underlying flaw never became public knowledge while any of this was happening. There was no trial, no settlement number argued over in a courtroom, no headline in any New York newspaper at the time, partly because a newspaper labor strike happened to be underway in the city during part of that period, genuinely limiting coverage of ordinary business. Compare that quiet, several million-dollar repair bill to what a public admission might plausibly have cost. Tenants breaking leases inside a tower rumored to be structurally unsound, a public relations disaster attached to one of the largest banks in the country, sheer price pressure on Citicorp itself, and years of litigation over who exactly was liable for a design flaw nobody had caused with any intent to harm anyone. Whether or not the decision to stay quiet was the ethically ideal choice is still debated in engineering ethics courses to this day, but financially, it is not a close comparison. The gap between the cost of a quiet fix and the cost of a public crisis is, again, the actual subject of this video. Chapter 7: This Keeps Happening. The Citicorp Center case is remembered today as a rare success story, specifically because LeMessurier chose to disclose the flaw and fix it before anything failed. Most versions of this exact decision, made by someone else, in some other building, do not end the same way. 3 years later, in 1981, a hotel in Kansas City called the Hyatt Regency held a Friday evening dance in its atrium when 2 elevated walkways, suspended above the crowded lobby by steel rods, collapsed onto the people below. The original design called for a single continuous rod running through both walkways, a connection strong enough to hold the load. During construction, exactly like the bolted joints at Citicorp, a fabricator proposed a change, splitting that single rod into 2 shorter rods, one supporting the upper walkway, one continuing down to the lower one, which nearly doubled the stress carried by the connection holding up the upper walkway. That change was approved without anyone independently rechecking the new math against the original design loads. 114 people died that night, making it, at the time, the deadliest structural collapse in United States history. The difference between Citicorp Center and the Hyatt Regency walkways is, almost exactly, the difference between a phone call that got asked and answered in time, and one that never happened at all. A more recent example follows a similar shape, without the same body count. In San Francisco, a 58-story residential tower called the Millennium Tower, completed in 2009, was later found to be sinking and tilting far more than its engineers had projected, discovered gradually by residents and outside engineers years after people had already bought units and moved in. The developer, the city, and multiple engineering firms spent years disputing, much of it out of public view at first, exactly how much the building had sunk, who had known what and when, and who would pay for a fix, eventually estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, a dispute that only fully became public once residents and lenders forced the issue into litigation. Chapter 8: The Real Lesson and Why It Is Not Really About Skyscrapers. Here is the structural point sitting underneath all 3 of these stories. In any sufficiently complex project, A skyscraper, a hotel atrium, a residential tower built over soft ground, the gap between a design on paper and the building actually constructed is where risk quietly accumulates, usually through small, reasonable-looking decisions made under time and cost pressure, each one individually defensible, none of them individually reviewed against the full consequences of every other change happening at the same time. The specific difference that separates a near miss you eventually turn into a case study from a genuine catastrophe you turn into a memorial is almost never the size of the original mistake. It is what happens the moment someone in a position to know the truth discovers it. Disclose immediately, absorb a real but survivable cost, and fix it before the storm arrives, or say nothing and let the cost of concealment compound quietly until the day it cannot be hidden anymore, at a much higher price, paid by people who never agreed to take that risk in the first place. That same calculation repeats constantly outside of construction entirely, in product recalls delayed, because admitting a defect looks more expensive in the short term than it actually is, in audits that quietly get softened because flagging a real problem threatens a quarter's numbers, in credit exposure inside financial institutions that stays unreported for years, because disclosing it immediately looks worse than hoping it resolves itself. Citicorp Center never fell. The building that stands on Lexington Avenue today is, structurally, one of the sounder towers of its era, precisely because one engineer decided that telling an inconvenient truth immediately was worth more than protecting his own reputation for a little while longer. This channel exists to pull apart stories exactly like this one, the ones where the headline sounds like a strange, almost unbelievable near miss, and the real story underneath it is a financial and structural mechanism that keeps repeating, in industries that look nothing alike on the surface. If that is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to the Money Current, because the currents that move the world's money are rarely the ones that make the news on their own. If this kind of story is worth your time, hit like and drop a comment below. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And if you want more deep dives like this every week, subscribe now. It's free, and it's the best way to support the channel.